Good afternoon and welcome back for CPAIR's Ask Me Anything webinar with Pamela Epstein. I'm Shanita Penny, Executive Director of the Coalition for Cannabis Policy, Education, and Regulation. We're super excited to jump into all things hemp, but before we do so, Pam, please take a moment and introduce yourself to our audience.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. I am the Chief Legal and Regulatory Officer for Terpene Belt. Terpene Belt is a hemp company specializing in non-cannabinoid steam distilled hemp essential oils. But I have worked both in cannabis before. In California, I was the president of the California Cannabis Industry Association and have a breadth of experience that covers both industries.
Thank you for that introduction. And trust me, guys, she is just scratching the surface. You'll get to know even more as she answers your questions and mine. All right. Before we get into the questions, Pam, I need you to take us back to the 1600s, the early 1900s, but let's just talk about the history of hemp in America.
Well, hemp has a really prolific history, right? I think some would argue that the Constitution may be written on hemp. Who knows? But it was one of the original cash crops. It's something that was iconic. And then over time, as the cannabis kind of prohibition came out, hemp got scooped up into that. So as we look for ways to reintegrate the plant, 2018 or really 2014 happened with the pilot program, and then 2018 brought us into what we're going to talk about now, which was really, it was done for farmers. It was truly an industrial hemp application, and it was meant to help fallowing fields in Kentucky. It was truly to bring in that non-cannabinoid seed, stalk, fiber, all these uses that hemp could be good for. And then it kind of ushered in from behind, which has now become the front runner of hemp, which is cannabinoids. So it's all from the same plant, Cannabis sativa L, right? We all love it. So let's talk more about hemp.
All right, let's get into it. You mentioned the year 2018, and so I want to make sure that our audience is keeping up. You talked about how critical a crop this was for America at different times. We know that at some points in our history, you were required to grow hemp. Folks paid their taxes in hemp. So I want to talk about the 2018 Farm Bill because you mentioned the year. When you look at some of these products that are on the shelf, there's this huge stamp that talks about the 2018 Farm Bill. What happened in the 2018 Farm Bill specific to hemp?
Okay, so I think it's important to take a step back and talk about what the Farm Bill is,
Ooh,
right? So
great
the Farm
place to start.
Bill is an omnibus package. It is hundreds of pages long. When we talk about hemp, it's like a footnote. It's maybe a page condensed of all of that information, but it was monumental for the hemp industry. So there was a lot of consternation as that bill was being discussed. When you talk about who are the fathers of that bill, right? Mitch McConnell's office. There was Chuck Grassley saying this isn't about marijuana. This is about industrial hemp. It really had that opportunity to be the wedge, right? It was the first time that we as a nation kind of birthed what hemp was. And we had this definition that was very expansive. Hemp is the cannabis sativa L plant, all extracts, all derivatives, all cannabinoids, all acids, all isomers, all salts of acids, whether growing or not, with a 0.3 tetrahydrocannabinol concentration on a dry weight basis. Now, that verbal word salad means a lot of things. And so it was really intended for seed, stalk, fiber, and at that time, CBD, which was really what we saw take off. But as we go back and really break that language down, that use of the word all really became pivotal because it was everything that you could do. And I like to think of the hemp industry as we know it today, like a COVID baby, right? Like when 2018 or when 2020 happened, there was a lot of innovation and people stuck inside, and there was a lot of excitement. Remember what was also happening in 2018 around that time was cannabis. Regulated cannabis was starting to take off. So there was a lot more need for access. And what we saw at the same time that regulated cannabis was having this really difficult time to start, where it was really hamstrung and burdened by regulation, and you couldn't get access. And we had local control issues where people just weren't getting what they needed. You had this other CBD coming and the CBD drop off. And what were you going to do with that? You have smart, innovative actors in the cannabinoid space. And so what they started to do was convert material from CBD into Delta 8 and that was like the first little baby step, right? Like dip your toe in. What's Delta 8? It's a cousin of Delta 9. It's less intoxicating. It can be made through the conversion of CBD from hemp. And when that kind of got out of the box and nobody said anything, then we went a little further. And that was around Delta 9. And so that's really what we started to see, was if something started as hemp and we didn't have as much awareness or scientific understanding, it started to blow up a little bit more. Because what is it? The most important thing I think that we can talk about today is consumers. What do they want? They want cannabinoids. And that is what they were able to get in these dry states, specifically Tennessee, Kentucky, places that people couldn't get access. We started to see access bubble up through hemp.
I want to stop you there, and I want to make sure that folks are following us. When we talk about a dry state, we're talking about a state where cannabis is not legal yet. We are talking about the fact that consumers in those states want cannabinoids. And this was the next best thing. And let's talk about the fact that so many of these consumers grab onto the idea of legality and it being safe, and they liken it to what they know about cannabis.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest conflict here, and the group of people that suffer the most are misinformed or uninformed consumers, right? Because what we've taught them is both that if something is federally legal, it is federally protected. I would liken this more to the dietary supplement world, right? People think that all dietary supplements are approved by the FDA. 1/3 of Americans or more would be surprised to know that the FDA really has a hands-off approach in that industry. And unless you have a new dietary ingredient or there's a problem with a dietary supplement, that's the only time they get involved. I think most people are more familiar with that GRAS concept, or generally recognized as safe, that the FDA approves food before it gets to you. And GRAS was a concept that came around in 1958. And so either you had things that were safe pre-1958, or you go through what is considered a self-GRAS or a new GRAS determination, where the FDA is notified and they get involved. And so when people see products on the shelves in grocery stores, in convenience stores, etc., they believe that those products have a certain stamp of approval from the federal government. So when the Farm Bill happened and we made hemp legal, and I should go back and say, remember, for those of you who are joining us that maybe don't know the whole history of hemp, that verbal word salad that I said also pulled out of the Controlled Substances Act hemp. So whereas marijuana and Delta 9 and all of these cannabinoids that could be derived from marijuana still live on Schedule 1, all of hemp was removed from the CSA. So when you see something that's federally legal in commerce, that's what consumers believe is safe. So they're confusing the regulation of marijuana that they see in other states with a federal legal status, but an unregulated environment, which we'll talk about later is not so unregulated, but.
Well, that's a great place to kind of pause and get into these questions. Because while you have spelled it out very well for us, I just want to start with the question of what exactly is legal. And we're going to dig into, what is happening at the state level versus what is happening at the federal level. So you just said hemp is now pulled out of the Controlled Substances Act. So this is now descheduled. So now that we're talking about this product that is descheduled, there is no regulation at the federal level for this, which is the opposite of what we've seen, with cannabis. States have legalized, states have regulated, and the Congress, our federal government has stayed out of it. So the legal products in the cannabis space are regulated at the state level. Now let's talk about what's happening with hemp. Federal government descheduled hemp. And now we have states that have said, whoa, these products are, getting into the hands of young people under 18, under 21 in some states. There are people reporting adverse events because of these products. So what are states doing now that this federally legal product is available to consumers?
It's a little like a whack-a-mole patchwork out there is what's happening. And I think it's important to note when we say what was pulled out of the CSA, there's still some arguments about what that means, because cannabinoid agents, or those things that are fully synthetic that don't exist in the plant, still live on the schedule and wouldn't be changed by the definition of hemp. So what you have, we talked about Delta 8, we talked about Delta 9, then there's these other cannabinoids, these alphabet soup of hemp cannabinoids, I will say. My favorite is THC-JD because, they made a cannabinoid for lawyers. But there's things like THCP and HHC, and those are like a quasi-legal state, I would say, because there's an argument that some of them can be made from CBD-based material and is a derivative of a derivative of a derivative still covered by that definition of hemp. Or is it fully synthetic and cannot be made from CBD? So those are arguably still on the schedule. But the states are all taking a different approach. And I think you have to look at it like a multi-layer filter. So states that have a robust medical or adult use program tend to take a more hardline stand on prohibiting intoxicating hemp because they've paid in to this system and they have players who are trying to protect it and they're trying to ensure there's not confusion between the two. Then you have states that haven't done anything, or notoriously dry states that then are more comfortable with the verbiage of hemp or cannabinoid regulation, and they start to regulate. And then you have a sieve where it's just, I'm going to take the Farm Bill and I'm going to apply it in my state and I'm going to do nothing at all. So you have this gradation, but at the same time that cannabis is insular, meaning that if it's a state-driven exercise, like you said, and it's federally illegal, you can't cross state lines.
Right.
But the thing about hemp is it's federally legal, therefore it is protected by this concept we call the Dormant Commerce Clause. We trade as one organization or one country, right? Can't tariff something from New Jersey that comes into New York, right? It's all one. And so you have this interstate commerce happen, but then you have all of these different states starting to regulate very differently. And when we go back to what's the consumer confusion, cannabis is all marked, right? You have to have the most, you have to have like a bastardization, to use the word, I hope it's okay on LinkedIn, of a universal symbol because it's not universal.
Right.
It's state by state specific. But every state that regulates marijuana has a universal symbol.
Right.
Cut to hemp, which is what you're saying. They either say Farm Bill compliant, federally legal. None of that gives the consumer the ability to have awareness that I am about to consume a product that contains cannabinoids. And wait, I may need to stop before I consume part of it or all of it.
Absolutely. You wouldn't believe the number of times a friend, a family member, or someone that I've just crossed paths with in this space has come to me and said, oh yeah, I'm using this to help me sleep. And it doesn't get me high. And I take a very quick look at it. And there is no indication for this person to understand that they are in fact consuming something that may intoxicate them. And this is a huge threat to individuals. It's a huge threat to our workforce. And I want to talk a little bit about how we can, in the time that it's going to take for us to see a federal framework, what can states do? And then I want to talk about what companies entering and playing in this space can do to help consumers do exactly what you just said and understand what they're actually consuming.
So as states look to regulate this new industry or form compatible regulation with the existing marijuana regulation that they have, they need to look at what regulation has worked in cannabis, what regulation hasn't, because we don't want to take burdensome regulation and force everything in to the marijuana channels, but states needs to take a consumer awareness, consumer protective approach, right? So things that are simple and easy that most of us already would know to do, universal symbols, right? Government warnings, testing of final form products, all allergen warnings, right? Things that you would do on a traditional CPG product. That's really where we want to start, right? If we want to use this amazing opportunity where I like to say I'm a descheduled girl that has to live in a rescheduled world, right? I want to see cannabis proliferation. If we start with what we're willing to live with and what we know worked in cannabis, in hemp, and if the companies show up to do that, then they're going to get better regulation. Then they're going to get sensible regulation. Because when the regulatory pendulum swings back, it'll swing back harder if you just take an approach of, when you get around to regulating me, I will accept regulation.
Right.
Really? Because I don't think you want to accept any regulation that comes your way. I think you want to usher in the regulatory environment that you want to play in. And if you want to do that, then you got to show up and do more. And I get that when you get to live the life of freedom, that it's hard to be constrained. Ask any cannabis operator who was operating pre-regulation. They love that, but you got to show up to the party you want to be at.
Absolutely. I'm thrilled to see the number of regulatory convenings, the number of patient, consumer, and even other stakeholder education series really taking on this issue and not making it an afterthought. There's really some leadership right now around leveraging the experience and expertise of folks that have been involved with legalizing and regulating cannabis and taking those lessons learned and applying them in the specifically intoxicating hemp space. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that you and I have done together with an organization, ASTM. So when we talk about what states are doing well, what companies are doing well, that's great. But we need an international standard. We need, national standards and just consistency in how we are going to bring these products to market. And so I want to just take a moment to highlight some of the work that you've done. You just talked about the need for these labels, and you are wearing a
TIC symbol. I would love everybody to say, what is your TIC number? TIC stands for total intoxicating cannabinoid content. Right. So until we start to really understand what all of these, there's like 100 plus naturally occurring cannabinoids. The cannabis plant is this prolific, wonderful plant that just is the giving tree. It wants to help. So while we start to parse out and understand them, what we know to be a universally accepted non-intoxicating cannabinoid is CBD. Everything else we kind of have to adjust and learn from. CBD, CBG, CBN may fall in there to a certain degree. But when you're talking about THCs, and there are several of them, if you have a symbol that's both universal and conveys that to a consumer, it is akin to AVB, right? When you pick up an alcoholic beverage, as that AVB goes up, you may be able to consume less of it. You can have more beer and wine than you do a spirit. Why? Because that AVB is consistent. So if we start to put something on a package that's relatable like that, it is going to train consumers to be more aware of their consumption, and B, it's going to allow them to have a universal symbol. And that universal symbol is already active on ASTM. It's a symbol for products containing cannabinoids. And one of the great things about it being universal is over time, if we use the same symbol for everything, TIC and non-intoxicating cannabinoids, the universal designation for the absence thereof medically is null. So you could just have NULL on the same symbol. And then we really start to have this unique standardization where everybody's talking in the same vernacular, whether you buy a product in Tucson, Arizona, or you buy it in Timbuktu, everybody would have that same lexicon. And so those are some of the things that I think industry actors can do today, and regulators, legislators can take a hold of. I think it's important to note there's a lot of really great hemp actors. There's a lot of really great cannabis actors that also act in hemp. It's just we have to raise the boat all together.
Totally. I love the tick symbol, and I think it's one of the things that will help to normalize these products. You said AVB a couple of times, and I want to make sure everybody knows it's ABV. She was just excited.
Yep, alcohol by volume.
Yes. So I want to talk a little bit. There's a question here. What are the most pressing public health concerns related to intoxicating hemp products?
I think it's the lack of standardization and product testing, right? Because if you don't have quality assurance and quality control metrics, then you don't know what's getting out into the marketplace. And that is a real concern for consumers. If they don't understand what's in the product, if the product has this amalgamation of all these different cannabinoids and they don't understand what they are, you're creating liability. So really, when companies look to why they want to invest in regulation, it's also to reduce their liability on the other side. So everything should be driven for consumer awareness and consumer safety. Like those should be the driving forces.
Absolutely.
And I think that's also the biggest weak point that we have right now, right? Like, for example, the only time regulatorily you are required to test hemp federally is at the farm gate. It's when before you harvest, 30 days before you harvest.
Right. And what are they testing for at that particular point? It's a singular thing.
They're testing for THC delta 9, but they're testing for total THC. So for some of you who are more nuanced in this and have heard of THCA or have seen THCA flower from hemp, what is that? I think it's important. If you don't know, let's talk about it for a second. So at the farm level, we test for total THC. Total THC is THCA plus delta 9. And why did the USDA provide that metric? Because THCA is more abundant in flower. As soon as you apply heat or pressure to THCA, it immediately converts to delta 9. So the only way that you are going to consume flower, my favorite fun fact is if you put a baby in a bunch full of cannabis flower, nothing would happen to them except they get sticky, like even if they put it in their mouth. But the second you apply extreme heat or pressure, that's where the decarboxylation happens. That's where that conversion happens. So when we test at the farm level, farmers are subjected to total THC, right? And if they look downstream and they see THCA flower at 20%, and they're testing in the field and they have to be 0.3%, some farmers are getting their crops destroyed because they don't understand why as soon as it leaves its whole flower, it can be higher. And so there's this level of confusion that happens. And that's where testing metrics across the board become really important because we're selling arguably marijuana when you're selling high THCA flower. And we've seen one of the other relatable aspects of that is if you go into a dispensary and you see the THC on the flower jars, they've added that together because that's a requirement of the COA by most or all regulated states. So this is where we need to have consistency and unity within the cannabinoid space.
100%, 100%. And so you've talked about one regulatory body being involved at the farm gate, but after that, there's not another regulatory agency that is going to guarantee a safe product by the time you are making these purchases. And that's the current state today. So when we talk about frameworks that would, address these gaps, what are we looking at? I mean, we now have 39 states with some kind of legal medical cannabis, whether it's, adult use in the 24 states that have moved all the way to post-prohibition. What are we talking about in terms of federal frameworks? What are your thoughts around where this should go?
I think we've got the FDA saying over a long period of time that they don't have enough authority or they have concerns or they issue adverse event, data or they issue warning letters. I think the one I saw most recently that was concerning is there was a company out of California putting CBD and full spectrum CBD into an IV. and intravenously putting that in people's bodies. Please, if you see that anywhere on Facebook, don't do it. We don't know how these cannabinoids interact that way.
Wow.
But so the FDA sends out those kind of letters, but they don't have that authority. And what I would say is I don't think they're the perfect agency for this, because if you look more at a compatible cannabinoid or what alcohol is, they are at TTB. And why are they at TTB? Because the active ingredient in alcohol is not safe for human consumption, right? It's causing an intoxication. Do I think that cannabis is safer than alcohol? It's different, right? Your body is meant to have it. Your liver isn't trying to expel it as an intoxicant. You may be intoxicated, but it's slightly different. But you need an agency similar to the TTB, where the active ingredient isn't going to go through a GRAS or a new dietary ingredient process, because it's not going to make it through, right? But all the other ingredients that are ever used in alcohol are registered as safe. And so I think we need to start thinking a little bit more out of the box federally if we want to have a federal regulator. And at the state level, it's really an interesting mixed bag as to whether or not it is a Department of Food and Ag, or whether it's a Department of Public Health, or whether it's the cannabis regulator. I think it's a state by state bespoke exercise, but all of these people have to come together, because unlike alcohol or tobacco, cannabinoids go through every modality you can think of to get into the human body.
Right.
So I think hemp has a really unique opportunity to cure one of the original sins of regulating marijuana, which is that manufactured products are not one thing.
That's right.
There's so many things. So I think there's a bite for a lot of people at that regulatory apple. I don't know if that was probably more of a...
I mean, I asked you what you'd like to see in the future, and I appreciate this perspective. And I think there are a ton of people who, are very quick to say, hey, regulate cannabis or regulate hemp like this. And I think that, to your point, we have a number of industries that we should absolutely be tapping into. And then some that we should say, hey, we've got to do things differently because this plant is just different. So no, I think that was a great answer. I do want to talk about, some of the things that we're seeing. Yes, states have recognized that there are public health issues, and states are saying, hey, I'm going to regulate. Some has gone as far as, banning, and that ban may be, just to give them an opportunity to, explore what regulations are actually needed. So I want to talk a little bit about what we've seen in terms of legal challenges by folks that have been in this industry, and to your point, been unregulated, and then now you have regulation coming in or a ban.
Yeah, I think bans are regressive, and we want to be progressive.
Sure.
I think yes, states need to have a little time to figure it out. But if consumers are getting these products in the delta of regulation, there is a backfill by illicit market actors. And what we need to stop doing is penalizing the good operators from the bad operators. Because when you make heavy-handed restrictions, good operators will comply. Bad operators or bad actors are already acting badly. They don't have any additional desire to do that. So when I'm going to tie two things together.
Okay. To
go back about how you want to be regulated, I think it's important that you want to be regulated like a wellness product, like a adult use product. So you want to be regulated like those things. You want the right to exist. You want to look backwards, because I think when you look at alcohol, when we regulated alcohol out of prohibition, we set licensing fees and regulation low to force social change and wide adoption. When you make limited license jurisdictions, when you don't allow more people to participate, you are then signaling to them, hey, the illicit market is robust, and we don't have a high level of enforcement priority right now, right? That a lot of the states with marijuana took a light touch of enforcement because they wanted people to come into the system, but light touch of enforcement without any enforcement at all creates that vacuum. So what we've seen when states take a regressive approach is a 750% increase in litigation around hemp since 2018, with the largest year-over-year increase of 142%. in 2024.
Wow.
And we've only seen more litigation. Where is this litigation kind of netting out? It's around a concept called preemption.
Okay.
And so what does that mean? That means, did Congress preempt a state from taking a more restrictive approach? Because generally in federalism, you have federal standards, and a state can always be more stringent,
Right.
but not less than a state, unless Congress has occupied that entire space and said no. So where does this come out with all the litigation we're seeing? It comes out with this very specific provision back in the Farm Bill that says you can't stop interstate commerce. Like, you are preempted, or not interstate commerce, from transportation.
Right.
And that is because not every state is square. And sometimes one state, because you can opt in of hemp and opt out of hemp. So if one state, you have to travel through one state to get to another to stay in that state. That's why they wanted to make sure that hemp could move across the country. Right. But there's been arguments that that preemption means that you can't regulate. What we've started to see, and we've seen it in the New Jersey, the Loki case out of the First Circuit. Sorry, I was getting my circuits confused. Out of the New Jersey case, is that no, states can regulate. They just can't prohibit their state freeways from being used in order to move product that may not be able to be distributed or sold in the state, but you can get it across the country. So that's sort of what we're seeing now with litigation. That's a salient one. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of litigation around law enforcement seizing products.
Yes.
And then not storing it appropriately, or waiting for the test, or waiting too long for the test. Right. We're seeing that pop up. We're seeing when states take a more aggressive approach. Can you change the definition of hemp from what it is at the Farm Bill? There's been a lot of consternation and litigation around that. So hopefully that forces Congress to act, because as these litigations are federal, mm-hmm. because we're talking about a federal standard, when that happens, it could go to the Supreme Court. And I don't know what they would do when confronted with an issue around the legality of THC from hemp versus marijuana.
You know, when I hear litigation, I think about my time in the cannabis space building businesses, and I know just how impactful and negatively impactful that can be on businesses. Talk to us a little bit about the implications of this litigation for the industry, and who's really, you know, paying for all this. Is it consumers? Is it, you know, these companies? How's this affecting the industry?
Impact litigation can impact positively, and it can impact negatively. Mm-hmm. And I think what we're seeing as this hemp litigation is proliferating is it can have a reverberating negative effect, right? I think at the beginning, states were then a little skittish to regulate, so there was more opportunity. Now we're seeing cases where there's more sophistication around science, there's more sophistication around understanding this issue, and you're going to get a little bit more aggressive. And I think as you start to see consumer awareness or consumer fraud potentially happening, because you're saying that it's federally legal or it's not intoxicating or any of these things, you're going to start to see consumer lawsuits that are going to pop up, right? Liabilities are going to pop up. Mm-hmm. And that could then have a negative impact on whether or not the legislature wants to regulate or they want to prohibit. So I think we have to be careful as we're just building litigation, mm-hmm. whether or not we're doing damage by doing so, instead of solutioning and trying to work with states and saying, look, there is an absolute need. Consumers want this. How do we do it well? Versus, I don't like what you're doing with your regulation, so I'm going to sue you. Yeah. And it's costing both, right? So it's costing the plaintiffs who start these lawsuits money. It's also costing the taxpayers money, because when attorney generals have to come in, or the state has to defend, what bucket of money are they using to defend these lawsuits?
Right.
Taxpayer dollars. So it definitely cuts both ways.
Yeah, I see that. And I can't help but also observe the increased conversation around hemp. I can start a conversation thinking it's going to be cannabis, policy focused, and 98% of the time at this point, we are switching gears and we're talking about hemp. Do you think these lawsuits, do you think this gap between federal, legalization or descheduling hemp from the Controlled Substances Act has had an impact on the number of, now federal bills, federal language that we've seen around hemp?
I absolutely think so. I think that's the net positive of it, right?
Great. Yeah.
It's creating a catalyst for conversation. It's creating the threat-opportunity, right? It's a threat and it's an opportunity.
I love it.
And let's really lean into the opportunity. Let's show up to force the issue.
Yes.
Right? Go to members of Congress. People want cannabinoids. Cannabinoids is not a tainted word yet. I really hope that we can do the work to ensure that we don't taint the word cannabinoid. Right. There is an incendiary reaction when you say marijuana. There's starting to be an incendiary reaction when you say hemp, right? Cannabinoids is clean. People want them. People want to discuss them. It's a word that we can unite around. Mm-hmm. And if we're not careful, it could go the other way because you're only one step away from a really bad adverse reaction from somebody who matters, right? Not everybody does matter, but what I mean when I say that is if it's a policy person, right? If it's a senator or a congressman or somebody high up in our government whose family member suffers, then that becomes a crusade campaign. Mm-hmm. It's really hard to fight that back, right? So let's use the positive momentum that we have around the conversation to have it in a responsible way and a sensible way. Because what we have in cannabis, I will be the first to tell you, is not sensible.
That's fair. That's fair. We've talked about the Farm Bill, but I want to talk, and we've talked about it being the 2018 Farm Bill. So I want to talk now about, potential changes to the Farm Bill that would be beneficial. We've talked about the gaps between state and federal law and the lack of regulation. We've talked about what this means for public health and public safety. So now I want to talk about what's been proposed to date that could actually help solve for some of these issues. And let's start with any of the amendments to the Farm Bill that have been proposed to date.
So I love this Farm Bill because the Farm Bill, for those of you who don't know, is supposed to be reauthorized every 5 years. If you can do the math, we're way past 5 years from 2018. There's been a lot of discussion. And there's been a lot of discussion around this issue. But like I said before, it's an omnibus package. Things are moving, not because of hemp, but because of things much larger than hemp. So don't think that the Farm Bill is going to go one way or another simply because of this issue. But there's been something called the Mary Miller Amendment. The Mary Miller Amendment, I think, takes a more prohibitionist approach. That language is found in appropriations, so it's still moving through the appropriations package. So it's not just the Farm Bill you have to look at, it's the Farm Bill and appropriations at the moment. And I think that was really a catalyst for conversation.
Yes.
That is, look, what we really need to see, or what I think is the most palatable that we want to address, is synthetic cannabinoids. So I want to back up for a second.
Sure.
So the way that the Farm Bill is framed moving into these discussions is truly siphoning off in industrial hemp.
Yes.
And industrial hemp that is visually distinguishing in the field. So that seed, stalk, and fiber, it's long, it's lanky, it has tiny cola at the top, versus what is arguably known as drug hemp, or hemp that, cannabis, drug cannabis. It looks like cannabis in the field, right? You wouldn't know the difference. It produces cannabinoids. And so they have industrial hemp laid out and hemp grown for another purpose. That hemp grown for another purpose is for arguably one of the primary uses is cannabinoid hemp. And therefore you had the Mary Miller Amendment backfill what that meant. So there's this basic language, and then Mary Miller came in, and that's where the starting point for the conversations in 2025 are.
Okay.
And that Mary Miller Amendment gets rid of synthetics. It addresses THCA flowers, so it says total THC in the base text, not just in USDA regulation. And then it goes through and it provides a lot of prohibitions all the way to non-detectable amounts of THC, which is a really hard concept to hit, especially if you're going to allow low dose products, which is what some states are allowing in adult use hemp cannabinoid markets. It doesn't provide for what we call work in progress hemp extract.
Okay.
So when you think about, and I think I saw a question out to the side about how does intoxicating hemp get in to the supply chain? Well, think about it this way, right? If you have a field of 100 acres of hemp, you harvest all that hemp, it's got 0.3% of THC, but you turn it into a distillate, you are concentrating all of that, you're going to have a product that pops hot, right? Because it's going to be a bunch of oil and you're putting all that THC together. That's what we call work in progress hemp extract.
Gotcha.
And that needs to run hot. And then you want to limit the amount of final form product, because the way that 3% escalating weight function works. So if you really want to understand why we talk about some of these intoxicating hemp products being in the market, being heavily potent, it's because we express cannabis concentration, cannabinoid concentration in milligrams. We express our food in grams. So for those of you not great at math, that is me. That's 1 to 1,000. So from a example of how that nets out, you've got a chocolate bar that on average weighs 50 grams. That means federally lawful, you can have 150 milligrams of Delta 9. And because we only regulate by one cannabinoid, that means all those other cannabinoids we talked about, you could have as many as you want in these products.
Right.
So when you have an escalating weight function, that becomes an issue. So dealing with that in the Farm Bill and just putting in very light, scant, driven, consumer driven requirements would allow for a lot of these states who have good, robust hemp programs to continue to have them.
Great.
Because we also need to address preemption, right? That we talked about that would clarify a lot of these lawsuits is if the states were given very clear authority to regulate the production, sale, distribution, manufacturing of these products while still preserving the ability for transportation. So a lot of that is what I hope comes out of the 2025 Farm Bill. And I hope that we don't just live in fear and have that Mary Miller Amendment, because it really would be a regressive policy. It would put all of these cannabinoids back on the schedule.
Right.
And then we're trying to move this ball forward. So it's everybody's responsibility. You know, I live to say this all the time. From the original, American Ben Franklin, he had unite or die, join or die was when we had the Constitutional Convention, right? It's unite or die time, guys. Like truly, if you represent, if you are a business, if you are in this industry, please, I implore you, come together, because we are stronger as a cannabinoid contingent than we are as hemp and cannabis.
I could not have said that better. Thank you for that. I love the plug. This isn't cannabis versus hemp. This is not a civil war as I've heard it described, several months back. This is exactly what we need to do, is get together on what's the most important thing to regulate cannabinoids, straight up. I really want to talk a little bit more. You went into, prohibitive language that is not progressive in the sense of, closing these gaps for consumers, for the industry. And you talked about a stakeholder group in, patients and consumers, but I want to talk about farmers a little bit. We're talking about a farm bill. How big, if you had to estimate, are we really talking about policies that affect American farmers right now?
Farmers are the most affected by the outside the farm gate activity. Right. A lot of farmers, and we grow about 1% of the total floral hemp that's grown in this country is grown at our farm in California for a non-cannabinoid use. But our company spends, and thank you very much, Chirping Belt, for hiring me, a lot of money on having legal compliance. Most farmers don't. So when you're supposed to be putting this out there in order for farmers to gain more access to take over fallowing tobacco fields, when they look and see, like we talked about with that THCA, they're having to destroy their crops, right? So we really need to do more to make investments in making industrial hemp viable outside of the farm gate, because you can grow anything you want, but if you don't have an outlet to sell it, right? If these other companies are concerned about intoxicating hemp, Levi's was supposed to run a whole thing on hemp related fabrics, but there was nobody to take the hemp and turn it into a textile.
Right.
If you don't have somebody to take the hemp and turn it into hempcrete, we've really just created a short stop of a supply chain. And then if you don't have USDA giving more money to do all of this infrastructure because they're hamstrung up by this intoxicating hemp question also, then we're not really doing the work of what was the intention of the Farm Bill. Right. Now, do I believe that that intention with a wedge should also apply to productive cannabinoid conversations and forcing us towards legalization? Yes. But this was about farmers. Right. So we really need to pay attention to farmers, and we also need to pay attention to how much hemp is being grown domestically versus how much is coming in from CBD oils, et cetera, that are then converted. Yeah. That maybe are coming from countries that don't share our same agricultural practices. Right. Right. And then we're also then doubling down on not helping farmers because it's that farm commodity that we want to do. So I think it's really important that as we discuss the Farm Bill, that's right, we keep farmers in mind. So thank you for that. And that we then look to Congress to help get all of these other pieces of legislation and regulations in place that allow for the downstream to happen outside of the farm gate. Right. Because the Farm Bill in the name is for farming. I like to use the analogy of garlic. So when you have garlic, what's inside the farm gate is when it's a bowl and when it's individual garlic cloves. The second you take that and you paste it, powder it, mince it, anything, it's outside of the farm gate. Right. It's not captured by the USDA anymore. It's captured by FDA and other public or other food related entities. So what we're doing with cannabis is we're saying everything lives within the farm gate because of the Farm Bill. And the Farm Bill is not a skeleton key. It doesn't get you out of all of these other federal regulatory apparatuses like grass, even though we're not enforcing on them. So that's sort of the sentiment that we should be thinking about when we're thinking about the Farm Bill and these other adjacent opportunities to get more interested congressional offices to talk about this issue. All right. I love that. So we've talked about the Farm Bill, but that's not the only way to potentially regulate hemp, right? We've seen now Wyden introduce legislation. So let's talk a little bit about some of these incremental reforms outside of appropriations and the Farm Bill, like the Cannabinoid Safety and Regulation Act. Yeah, I think that these are all good starting points for conversation. And remember, if we create pinholes and loopholes, we're only going to suffer the consequences later. Yes. So integrity and honesty in these conversations in the Hill is incredibly important, right? And escalating weight function is not something that should apply to downstream products. Right. We really have to move away from that, right? We talk about dry weight. Where is there a definition of dry weight? How do you apply a dry weight to a beverage, which is wet weight? So I think one of those integral, authentic conversations that need to be had is regulation bespoke by product type. And also the fact that we are, that escalating weight function is meant for in the field for flour, right? Flour is light, it's airy, it weighs the same thing every time. That's why it's 0.3%. Right. And it was meant to be de minimis. So we have to be honest about that conversation, or I think these bills could get farther along and then have an issue on a floor vote when somebody brings that up. So I think it's important to understand the conversation for today and be authentic and not look for pinholes and loopholes. And some of these bills need a little bit more work. There are opportunities for improvement. I love your framing. You know, a lot of this conversation is going to be beyond comprehension for folks that just haven't dealt in depth with some of the science and data around dealing with a plant versus other formats, right? And so I want to talk a little bit about the education of our lawmakers. We talked earlier about consumer education a little bit, but what are some of the kind of key components? What are the things that we should be researching and absolute on before we get into making regulations, especially at the federal level? Like, you can experiment at the state level some, right? And those regulators are talking to each other. Shout out to camera.
But what about the gaps that exist today? I talked to so many, staffers that want to talk to members of our Center of Excellence because they do understand a lot of the nuance that you've educated us on today.
Yeah, I think, look, everybody wants D9 to be free, right? Delta 9. I think paying attention to what are phytocannabinoids, what are things that come from the plant. Let's start with the ABC building blocks, right? Let's start with something that is digestible and easy and then continue to educate out from there. I think that honest conversation where things can be validated is really important. Do we want to shut businesses down? No. Right. I lived through that. Let's look at California before pre-MRSA, the staph infection that became the regulatory apparatus, my favorite. We shut down hundreds of businesses, thousands of SKUs, right? Let's learn from that. We don't want to, shut people down. We want to redirect, but we have to be open to that. And we have to be open and honest about these conversations. And if we're not, those doors get shut and then they just mistrust the industry. I think what you're seeing when the FDA wants to add hemp cannabinoids to an adverse event reporting form so they can see what these are doing in commerce. Look, adverse events are not bad. I don't want anybody to leave this conversation thinking that that is the case. You still eat lettuce, and there has been salmonella outbreaks since the beginning of lettuce, and there will be into the future. There was fecal matter found in Perrier. I had one the other day, right? It just means that we catch the sieve and then we can regulate better. Right. So as we look at those opportunities, be honest. That's the best thing that I can say, and provide that level of information, because staffers fact check, but staffers then go out and consume these products. So if we're not having those intentional, honest conversations, the reverberation is going to be much harder. But like you said, the laboratories of democracy are the states, and they're starting to figure it out. And when you see states go backwards and refine regulation, it's from lessons learned. So hopefully that information can go, bottom up.
Absolutely. A lot of people talk about, other countries outpacing the United States, as we have not addressed cannabis from a national perspective, right? As we talk about hemp, are there, examples in, on the international scene that we should be looking at, or where do you think the rest of the world is in comparison to the US?
I think everybody's a little confused by hemp at the moment. We're not alone. I think we have the opportunity to lead though here, and that's driving towards a cannabinoid future.
Right.
And so I just lean into the confusion being an opportunity. If we take that momentum,
sure,
we can stop a lot of these rash bans that are happening across the country.
Totally.
We could export them internationally. And that's the last thing I think we want to do.
Very cool. Very cool. We have a question here, and I think we've thrown a lot at you today. So this actually, I'm going to read it. It says, I'm very confused about how intoxicating hemp is produced, particularly when it's sold in flower form. So talk just a little bit about, is this coming straight off the farmer's truck and going to a shelf, or, what's happening in terms of production?
It's a little of a lot of things.
I can imagine.
Some of it, like I said, I think is THCA flower. So it's hemp. Some of it is diversion out of the regulated supply chain, potentially a product that didn't pass testing. It can come in a variety of ways, unfortunately. And that's really where the sieve of quality control and quality assurance testing of final form products are really important, specifically in hemp. And I think that's where we see the lacking, right? I think a lot of people have seen the Forbes articles or the CNN articles or the Politico articles about testing product where it tests above what it says on the label, or there's pesticides. One thing I do want to say about that is cannabis testing standards. A banana may not pass for heavy metals. We test cannabis more rigorously than we test any other product that you consume or that your children consume. So when you see a lot of these rash, recalls are pressure tests of a system.
Yes.
Do not fear or go elsewhere or think that illicit cannabis is better than regulated cannabis because there's recalls. If there is one thing that I can leave people with, is that is the signal that the system is working. It's also a signal that maybe we are testing too rigorously and need to reevaluate that. And we can do that on the hemp side where we have the laboratories of democracy at the state level. So a lot of this is symbiotic and give and take and learning lessons. But I hope that kind of gives you an idea of how these intoxicating hemp products come, or because they are manufactured. And then there's that escalating weight function that allows them to get to market.
Well, thank you. That was great. We've got about 5 minutes left. So Pam, I would love for you to, give us your final thoughts. What is, a call to action for, in addition to the call to action to unite, but what would you say to our audience as it relates to someone who wants to get involved with advocacy, someone who is already working in the space to lobby, helping draft laws? What would you leave them with?
What would I leave you with? That it's an opportunity-rich environment for those that want to show up to have an authentic, honest conversation about these issues. There has never been a better inflection point or moment where this is at the top of people's minds, that they know what this issue is, that if your legislature is discussing it, show up and say, I am a consumer. If you're a consumer and you want to do advocacy, I am a consumer and I want to have access to quality tested cannabinoids. And how that access gets to me could be hemp, could be marijuana. Like, I just need that access to be safe and accurate and done by the state. If you are a business, show up with a plan of what you can live with. If you are an existing cannabis company and you're getting into hemp, bring over those things that you can live with and that you want to do. Let's not let this be a race to the bottom where we just are like, throw the baby out with the bathwater. If I don't have to do anything, do nothing. And if you're a hemp company, show up with a badge that says I am a responsible actor, because there's a lot of you out there. And I know that it is hard to do that when other people don't. But the more people get in the boat, the better off we will be, because everybody's voice matters. And here we are fighting an opposition. There are people that don't believe that cannabis should be legal at all in this country. And so those are all people that are after this industry, and that's a collective. So don't let the arrows be pointed at each other so that other people's arrows can penetrate. Let's join and so we can fight that collaboratively.
I love it. I know I said this was going to be your last message to folks, but we have a question that has to be answered. This isn't a commercial or a plug for anyone, but we've said a lot. We have informed you. And so we now have someone who, as a consumer, wants to know, if I'm looking for intoxicating hemp products, what's a safe place to buy these products today?
I think you want to look at reputable companies. I think you want to be able to, a lot of good companies will have their COA QR coded.
Certificate of analysis tells you what's in your weed.
What's in your weed, exactly. You can look at a paper on CPR about what's in your weed and learn more about a COA. But if you do that and you look at it and you can see the testing results and they're batched and lotted, so you can see that it goes to that product, those are great places to buy them. If you are in a state that has regulated hemp, that is a great place to start. If you're not and you're buying it on the internet, look for those COAs, really understand what you're buying, and go to groups like CPR. Go to those platforms, ASA, Americans for Safe Access, Normal. They'll be able to give you the tools to make the best decision, because I get that not everybody lives in a regulated cannabis state or a regulated hemp state, and you want to get a hold of these products. So you have to be your best advocate at the moment.
100%. I think that's a great place to end. And I appreciate you all for tuning in. Thank you so much for joining us. We only scratched the surface on all of the knowledge that this woman holds. And we just really appreciate your time. If you want to learn more about CPAIR, check us out at cpair.org. You can follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. And we are here on LinkedIn. Please hit us up with your questions that we might not have gotten to today, questions that you'd like us to answer in the future. Our Center of Excellence is here to ensure that we take good data, good science, into our lawmakers' offices, share it with stakeholders who are all working so diligently to ensure that we have a federal framework that supports what's going on and working well in the states. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.